Hi guys, welcome back to A Page in the Chapter, or welcome if you are new here. My name is Paige and today I am giving you an introduction to fantasy. Guys, you have no idea how much I have missed standing in front of a camera and talking to you guys about books. You may have noticed I took a very unscheduled break. Basically, my boyfriend got COVID and so it was just easier to isolate at his house, but it was all very sudden. I didn't have time to pre-film, obviously. I didn't have access to any of my books or my filming equipment, so there was a very unscheduled break, but I am home now. I get to film again and gosh, how I have missed you. Anyway, fantasy is one of my favourite genres. I'm not reading a lot of it at the moment. This summer, like, all I've wanted to read are romances, and now I'm weirdly craving classics, but the weather's gonna turn soon and I am really excited for some fantasies in some cold, dark English autumn weather. Nothing brings me more joy, honestly. And so here is essentially just a list of books that I think would be a good place to start if you are interested in getting into fantasy. Pretty much all of these are YA because I like YA fantasy. I tend to read more YA fantasy than adult fantasy, and YA fantasy is way more entertaining and easier to understand and get into. Whilst I love how complex adult fantasy can be, I think YA fantasy is much more accessible and a much better place to start if you're looking to start exploring this genre. Here is just a list of a couple of books or kind of themes of books that I think you should test out to try and, like, you know, explore the fantasy genre and see if you like it, and it's a good stepping stone to some bigger fantasy books. If you guys like the sound of this video and you like what you have seen so far, why not hit that big red subscribe button down below and stay tuned for future content. I upload twice a week on a Wednesday and a Friday, so there is no shortage of bookish content here. You're not going to want to miss it. And now that that's out of the way and I've, you know, gone through everything that I had in my head that I wanted to say to you, let's just get straight into talking about the books. The very first book on this list is Stardust by Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman is very beloved in the book community in general, but particularly in the fantasy community, and he has such bigger fantasy series later that this is such a nice little one to start with. You have most probably seen the film and you know how cozy and good vibes the film is. The book is even better. They're very different and I love them for very different reasons. This book is definitely aimed at an older audience, so don't be put off by the fact that the film is kind of a children's film. This is not a children's book. Essentially, this follows our main character Tristan. It's like early Victorian era times. He essentially promises this girl Victoria that he will go and get a fallen star for her, and his journey for the fallen star takes him across the wall into this like magical village. It's an incredibly unique and cozy, wonderful story set in the English countryside in the early Victorian era, and I think why this would be a great introduction to fantasy is that it's not that heavy on the fantasy. It has fantasy elements. He's chasing a fallen star, there's like elements of witches in this. If you've seen the movie then you know that there's magic very much in this story, but our main character doesn't really have any magic of his own. He's just exploring this world as an outsider, the same way you might feel like you're exploring fantasy as an outsider. And so it's just a really great introduction to some of these mythical characters without you having to learn like a whole new magic system. This is just a very short one book wonder that is a great introduction. These next books I'm going to show you kind of have a theme. It will make sense when I explain. And so my next recommendation is The Fate of the Tearling or Three Dark Crowns. Essentially these are both YA kind of queendom fantasies, and the reason that I think you should start or at least explore these is because they're a really great introduction to court life and court politics in fantasy. My favourite element in fantasy, particularly adult fantasy, is how in-depth the politics usually is. Every decision has a consequence that you won't even think of when you read them making that decision, and it will come up a couple books later. It's a very cool thing in fantasy, but it can be incredibly daunting, and I think these are a really great introduction to that kind of world. Now I will say I personally prefer The Fate of the Tearling by Erica Johansen. I hated the ending to this trilogy. Like, the last book absolutely destroyed my love for this series, but the first two books I was absolutely obsessed with, binge read them, could not get enough. Three Dark Crowns I've heard good things about, but I DNF'd it. But The Fate of the Tearling follows our main character Kelsey, and she is becoming queen, but basically everyone is trying to assassinate her, so her whole life she's been hidden away in the forest, and now it's time for her to go to court and actually learn how to be a queen. So this one is good in terms of getting you used to different timelines, getting you used to different court factions, stuff like that. And then Three Dark Crowns by Kendare is about three different sisters who are all heirs to the throne, basically battling it out for their faction to become like the leading faction. And this one is great to get you used to multiple POVs because you've got three very, very clear, distinct points of view in this book. They're very easy to follow, they're very clearly marked out, and they all have different tones. This is also good in terms of getting you used to multiple point of views where you might like some characters more than others. It happens in fantasy. It can't be avoided, unfortunately. Both of these series have merits for different reasons. I just personally preferred this one, but I thought I would give you both recommendations because I think they're both great places to start. Next we have Cinderella is Dead by Kalynn Bayron, or really just any kind of fairy tale retelling. This one is just my personal selection and one of my personal favourites. Essentially, fairy tale retellings are a great place to start because you probably already know the story, especially in the case of Cinderella. You know the story. You've heard it so many times. There's no risk of you getting lost. You'll kind of know exactly where you are in the story, and there's already a magical element to fairy tales, and authors will exploit this and find new spins to put on this, and that's, you know, good. You don't just want to be reading exactly the same Cinderella story. It's a retelling for a reason, but because there is already that magic element in the original fairy tale, you'll be used to it, and it provides some structure for the author in terms of the magic system already, so you don't get a super complex, unique magic system, which sounds like a con, but I think is actually a pro, especially for when you're starting out. This puts a unique twist on Cinderella while still keeping it Cinderella, so you'll know where you are in the story, I promise you that. The penultimate book that I want to share with you is The Magician's Guild by Trudi Canavan. Yeah, I said that right. This is kind of a more adult Harry Potter. I think the last few books in the Harry Potter series, and like this gives me that vibe. This is also a magic school book. This is about a kingdom where there are a school of magicians, and they will go into the city on the king's orders to purge the city, and our main character throws a stone at the magicians and manages to break their impenetrable barriers, meaning that she is a magician herself, and so she is whisked away to the Magician's Guild, which is a magic school, and forced to learn. This probably has the most detailed world building and magic system of any of the books on this list, but it's still a YA. It's a trilogy, so it knows that it's got room to play with the magic system and the world building in future books, but it's also not such a long series that they need to just make the first few books boring. And I think in terms of diving in with a whole different world and a whole new magic system, this is a really good place to start because it's just not completely wild and out there, and our main character knows absolutely nothing, so you're very much learning as our main character learns, so it's less daunting and overwhelming. Hopefully that makes sense. And then the last book I would like to share with you is Kingdom of the Wicked by Kerri Maniscalco. This one is just really fun. I don't have very specific reasons like I did with the other books for why this is good. As an entry-level fantasy reader, this is just a good book and I have to recommend it. It's set in Palermo, which is in Sicily, which is like a modern day city, so there's not massive amounts of world building in that sense. There's no new magic world, which is very handy. Urban fantasy, I guess that is called. And this follows our main character, and she is a witch, and so obviously because it is modern day Italy, she is hiding her witchy bitch powers because, you know, don't want to get murdered. And then her sister goes missing, and so she makes a deal with the King of Wrath so that he will help her find her sister. And this journey leads her to meeting all of the King of Wrath's brothers, like the King of Lust and the King of Greed, etc, etc. It's essentially a Seven Deadly Sins retelling. I just found this super easy to read. I enjoyed it so much more than I thought I would. There's not a huge amount of magic in this book because it is mostly her dealing with the princes of sins. I obviously can't say much for the next few books because they're not out yet, but I do think that you'll want to get in on this series early whilst you still can. Yeah, it's only about 400 pages, which for a fantasy is really not that bad, and you read it so quickly. So I just think that this is a good book, and really the places where you want to start with fantasy, yes, you might want to explore multiple perspectives, yes, you might want to explore standalones or different magic systems or different mythical creatures, but at the end of the day you just want to read a good book. This is that. And so there are my recommendations for books to get you into fantasy. I do hope that you found this list helpful, that you enjoyed it. I really love fantasy and I really want to get back to it being like my main genre. It is still winning by a landslide in my genres on Storygraph, but I just feel like I haven't read fantasy in so long. So I think the next book I pick up will be a fantasy. If I can give you guys even the tiniest bit of joy that fantasy gives me with these book recommendations, then I really hope I did that. Let me know down in the comments what you think of these books. If you read fantasy, and if you don't read fantasy, why don't you, and what's stopping you? Because I promise you there is a book for you if you're willing to find it. And yeah, thank you guys very much for watching, especially if you made it this far. If you did make it this far, why not hit that big red subscribe button down below and stay tuned for future content. There is no shortage of bookish content here on this channel because I upload on a Wednesday and a Friday. I hope you guys have a wonderful week and there are absolutely no reading slumps in your future and you enjoy everything that you are reading right now. And I will see you for my next video. Bye guys.